Welcome home, Joseph. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked down at the man who had spent 6 months in London with his mistress, and she smiled like she had already won. Joseph Hawthorne came back expecting to find a broken woman. What he found was a wife who had stopped waiting the day she received his letter, the letter that told her he wasn't coming back. She had read it once, folded it carefully, and gone to work. 6 months later, he didn't recognize her. Neither did anyone else on that estate. If you've ever been left behind by someone who assumed you'd stay exactly where they put you, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? The carriage wheels hit the familiar stone of Hawthorne Estate's front drive, just as the last light bled out of the October sky. Joseph Hawthorne heard the crunch beneath him and felt something loosen in his chest. The particular relief of a man returning to ground he believed would always belong to him. 6 months. He had been gone 6 months. He told himself it hadn't felt that long. Beside him on the carriage seat, Clara Whitmore adjusted the collar of her traveling coat and peered through the window with the expression of a woman already measuring curtains she didn't own. "It's larger than I imagined," Clara murmured. "It's exactly as I left it." She turned to look at him with those pale eyes that had once seemed so full of life. "And your wife?" Joseph said nothing. He reached for the door handle as the carriage slowed. He hadn't thought much about Emily during the ride from London. He'd thought about the debts he'd quietly accumulated. He'd thought about Edmund Vale's last letter, which had been oddly brief. He'd thought about the way certain members of his London circle had begun to look past him at dinner parties in recent weeks, as though waiting for news they already knew. He had not thought about Emily. That he would later understand had been his first mistake. The carriage stopped. Joseph stepped down onto the drive and waited for the rush of familiar sounds: boots on gravel, the shuffle of servants, a footman moving to collect luggage. He waited for the estate to respond to his presence the way it always had, like a household that knew its master had come home. Silence met him instead, not complete silence. He could hear wind moving through the oak trees along the eastern fence. He could hear Clara stepping down behind him. He could hear a dog somewhere in the distance barking twice and then going quiet. But no one came forward. He stood in the drive and looked at the front of his house. Lamps burned in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimneys. The estate was very much alive. It simply did not acknowledge him. "Joseph." Clara's voice carried a thin note of uncertainty. "Should we not go in?" He moved toward the front door. It opened before he reached it, opened from the inside slowly, by a young footman Joseph didn't recognize. The boy held the door without meeting his eyes. Said nothing. Stepped back. Joseph walked into his own entrance hall and stopped. The hall had changed, not dramatically. The furniture was the same. The portraits along the wall were the same. But there was an order to the space that hadn't existed before, a cleanliness that felt deliberate rather than decorative. Flowers he didn't recognize in a vase he didn't remember buying. A small ledger sitting open on the writing table near the stairs. A chair repositioned near the fire that now faced the door rather than the wall. Small things. But Joseph noticed them all. He noticed them because they were not his choices. Clara stepped in behind him and began pulling off her gloves with the satisfied air of a woman who had arrived somewhere she intended to stay. "Charming," she said, looking up at the ceiling. "I expected something more dated." "It is dated." "It doesn't look dated." She paused. "It looks managed." Joseph turned toward the staircase. She was standing at the top of it. Emily Winthrop. Hawthorne stood perfectly still on the upper landing, with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes fixed on him with an expression that took him a full 3 seconds to identify. Not anger, not grief, not the desperate relief of a woman who had spent months watching the road. Nothing. She wore a deep green gown he had never seen. Her hair was dressed simply, no elaborate curls, no expensive combs. Just clean dark lines pinned back with the confidence of a woman who no longer dressed to be noticed. He thought wildly, like she had somewhere important to be. She looked like herself, more herself than he had ever seen her. "Welcome home, Joseph." 3 words, quiet, even polite. The words of a hostess receiving a guest, not a wife receiving a husband. Clara looked up at her. Something shifted in Clara's expression, a flicker of reassessment quickly buried. She smiled up the stairs. "You must be Emily. I've heard so much." Emily's gaze moved from Joseph to Clara, with the calm deliberateness of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because she needed to rehearse nothing. "Miss Whitmore." A pause light as breath. "I hope the road from London wasn't too difficult. The autumn rains have made the northern routes unreliable." Clara blinked. "We managed well enough." "I'm glad." Emily began to descend the stairs. Not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of a woman who understood that the staircase belonged to her. "I've had rooms prepared in the East Wing. Mrs. Harmon will show you up when you're ready." Joseph opened his mouth. Emily looked at him directly for the first time. The look was brief, precise, and entirely unreadable. "You'll want to speak with Edmund first, I imagine. He's been waiting in the library since midday." "Edmund?" Joseph frowned. "What does Edmund need at this hour?" "That," Emily said, reaching the bottom of the stairs, "is a conversation the two of you should have without me." She turned and walked toward the corridor that led to the drawing room. Not a glance back, not a hesitation. Joseph stood in his own entrance hall and felt the ground shift slightly beneath him. Clara touched his arm. "She's very composed." "She's always been composed." "No." Clara watched the corridor where Emily had disappeared. "Not like that." Edmund Vale had worked as estate manager at Hawthorne for 11 years. He was a careful man, meticulous with numbers, comfortable with ambiguity, and gifted at making problems disappear before they needed explaining. Joseph had trusted him completely. Edmund was sitting behind the library desk when Joseph entered, and he stood too quickly, knocking a ledger with his elbow. "Mr. Hawthorne, you've arrived." "Evidently." Joseph moved to the chair across from him and sat. "What couldn't wait until morning?" Edmund's jaw worked for a moment. "Several things, sir. The autumn rent collections there were shortfalls. There are always shortfalls in autumn." "Not of this nature." Edmund reached for the ledger he'd disturbed and set it on the desk between them, but didn't open it. "Mrs. Hawthorne has been active, in the accounts." Joseph went still. "What do you mean active?" "She requested access to the household ledgers in August. I provided them. She is the lady of the house. I didn't feel I could—" "You gave her access to the estate accounts." "She asked very specifically, Mr. Hawthorne. She asked about the tenant accounts, the farm wages, the supplier invoices going back to January." Edmund's hands were flat on the desk now. "I want you to understand that some of the irregularities she found things, sir. Things I had been managing quietly for years. Things I believed you didn't need to concern yourself with." Joseph leaned forward. "What things?" "Discrepancies in the farm wage records." Edmund's voice dropped. "I had been adjusting the outgoing figures, small amounts, consistent over time. The cumulative total is—" He reached into the desk drawer and produced a folded paper, set it down, pushed it across. Joseph unfolded it. The number at the bottom made the room go quiet around him. 8 years, Edmund said softly. Joseph looked up. "I began in 1809, sir. The year you and Mrs. Hawthorne were married." The silence between them had weight to it. "Emily found this," Joseph said. "Mrs. Hawthorne found this." Edmund nodded. "In September, she cross-referenced the ledgers with the original wage contracts the workers had signed. She went to the farms, Mr. Hawthorne. She spoke to the tenants personally. She sat in their kitchens." He paused. "She calculated every unpaid wage to the penny." Joseph set the paper down. He was aware of a sensation he hadn't felt in years, the particular cold of having miscalculated something enormously important. "Where are the corrected accounts?" "Mrs. Hawthorne has them." "Of course she did." Joseph rose from the chair. "We'll speak further tomorrow. Mr. Hawthorne." Edmund stood as well. There was something strange in the man's face, something that looked almost like relief. "She didn't expose me publicly. She came to me first, told me what she'd found, told me she was giving me the chance to confess it to you directly." He paused. "She said the people who'd lost wages deserved honesty, More than they deserved theater. Joseph walked out of the library without answering. He found Emily in the small sitting room at the back of the house, the one she had always preferred because its window faced the kitchen garden. She was writing a letter. She did not look up when he entered. "Why didn't you write to me about Edmund?" "I didn't know his address." She turned the page. "You didn't leave one." The silence stung. He crossed the room and stood near the fireplace. Watched her write. She had the focused stillness of a woman who had learned sometime in the last 6 months that other people's urgency was not her emergency. "Emily." Look at me." She set the pen down, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at him. Patient. Composed. I didn't know what he had expected. Tears, maybe. Some version of the woman he had pictured on the long road back from London. The woman waiting by windows, pale and diminished, grateful for his return simply because it ended the waiting. He had not permitted himself to fully examine that picture, but he had assumed it. He had built his return on that assumption. "You knew about Edmund before I left," he said. A pause. "Not entirely." "But you suspected." "I suspected something was wrong with the accounts." Her voice was quiet and even. "I mentioned it to you in the spring. You told me estate management wasn't my concern and that Edmund had handled things ably for years." He remembered. He remembered dismissing it over breakfast, barely looking up from the newspaper. "Emily, I'm not interested in relitigating the spring, Joseph." She picked up her pen. "What would you like to discuss?" "What I'd like to discuss," he said, "is why you didn't send for me when you found the discrepancies, when you had proof. Why didn't you write?" She looked up at him again. And for just a moment, only a moment, something moved behind her eyes. Something old and tired that had nothing to do with ledgers. "Because the last time I sent for your attention," she said softly, "you were on a horse to London the following morning." He had nothing to say to that. She returned to her letter. "Where is Miss Whitmore being housed?" he asked finally. "East Wing." A beat. 3 rooms from the servants' staircase. Not the guest suite on the 2nd floor. Not adjacent to the master bedroom. 3 rooms from the servants' staircase. He understood the message with perfect clarity. "Emily, you asked about Miss Whitmore's rooms, and I answered." She signed the letter and folded it neatly. "Good night, Joseph." Joseph did not sleep well. He lay in the master bedroom. Emily was in the adjacent room, the connecting door closed, and he discovered when he tested it quietly, bolted, and he stared at the ceiling and tried to locate the version of this night he had expected. In that version, he had come home confident and decisive. He had navigated Emily's hurt with a certain measured tenderness. He had eventually brought her to understand that their marriage had been a formality for years, that he and Clara were, that there was a natural. He couldn't finish the thought. It dissolved every time he reached for it. Because the woman he had come home expecting to manage was not the woman sitting in that room writing letters. He didn't know who that woman was. Morning arrived with the sound of horses and voices in the yard earlier than Joseph expected. He dressed without his valet, who he noticed had been reassigned quietly and apparently with perfect efficiency to other duties, and went downstairs to find the entrance hall already occupied. 3 men stood just inside the front door, turning their hats in their hands. Farmers from the look of their coats. 2 of them he recognized as tenants from the North Fields. The third was older, a man named Bram Hollis, who had worked Hawthorne land for 30 years. Emily stood facing them with the corrected ledger open in her hands. "Mr. Hollis," she was saying, "your wages for the season of 1815 show a discrepancy of £4, 7 shillings from what the original contract specifies. I want you to verify that figure with me before anything is formally recorded." Bram Hollis, who had removed his hat the moment he stepped inside, squinted at the page she held out. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, his own copy of the contract, Joseph realized, and held it alongside hers. "That's right, ma'am." His voice was rough and careful. £4 7. And the 1816 season. Another check. £3 2. I have £3 1. "Beggin' your pardon, ma'am, but I reckon it's 3 and 2. My wife kept the records separate. She's meticulous. Emily looked at him for a moment. Then we'll use your wife's figure. She made a notation. I appreciate her meticulousness. Hollis looked at her with an expression Joseph had never seen a tenant direct at anyone in his family. Not deference. Not gratitude exactly. Something quieter than both. Trust. Plain, simple trust. Mrs. Hawthorne. Hollis nodded once. Thank you. Joseph stepped into the hall. All four of them looked up. The two younger farmers glanced at each other. Hollis looked at Joseph with no particular warmth, tipped his head, and looked back at Emily. Mr. Hawthorne. Emily's voice was professionally courteous. I'm finishing the verification meetings this morning. The corrected wage calculations are ready to be distributed by end of week. I see. He looked at the three men, at the ledger in his wife's hands, at the way the room had organized itself around her without apparent effort. Carry on. She turned back to the farmers. He went to find breakfast. Clara was already at the dining table when he arrived. She had dressed carefully, too carefully for a country morning, in a gown suited more to a London drawing room. She was eating with the pointed ease of a woman determined to appear at home. She looked up when he sat. Good morning. Good morning. A pause. Your wife is meeting with farmers. She is? At 8 in the morning. Evidently. He poured his own coffee. The footman who might have done it was not in the room. Clara set down her fork. Joseph, I want to understand the situation here. The situation? With the estate. With, she gestured vaguely, her. He looked at her across the table. She was beautiful, Clara. She had been beautiful in London, brilliant at a dinner party, luminous at an assembly. She was the kind of woman who drew rooms toward her like light-drawing moths. He had found that irresistible once. He looked at her now and tried to locate what he had felt 6 months ago and found it thinner than he remembered. Like fabric that had looked rich in candlelight and showed its worn places in the morning. The estate has some financial irregularities that need addressing, he said. Because of your wife's interference. Because of my estate manager's theft. He said it flatly. Over 8 years. Emily discovered it. Clara blinked. Emily. My wife, yes. A silence. Well. Clara straightened in her chair. She's been busy. She has. And you're impressed by that. He looked at his coffee cup. He thought about Bram Hollis's face, about the ledger held open with both hands, about the way the entire household had turned smoothly and without announcement toward a woman who had spent 8 years being told she wasn't needed. I don't know what I am, he said honestly. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression, a recalibration quiet and quick. She picked up her fork again and said nothing. He found Margaret in the hallway outside the library. Margaret Ellison was Emily's closest friend, a widow of independent means who drove her own carriage and had opinions about everything. She had never liked Joseph. She expressed this by being excessively civil to him at all times. Mr. Hawthorne. She smiled the smile of a woman who had been waiting for this moment with enormous patience. Welcome home. Margaret. I hope the journey from London was comfortable. Well enough. He paused. You've been visiting often. Every week since August. She adjusted her gloves with perfect composure. Emily required company. She has servants. She required company. Margaret's voice was measured and precise. She learned in your absence that she was quite capable of managing without you. I was here to ensure she didn't simply do it quietly and let you take credit for it upon your return. Joseph stared at her. Margaret smiled again, more genuinely this time. She won't take revenge, Joseph. That's not who she is. But she will not pretend. I want you to understand that before you mistake her politeness for permission. She walked past him down the hall, her skirts perfectly arranged, her back entirely straight. He stood alone in the corridor for a moment. Then he went to find his wife. She was in the kitchen garden, not working in it, standing at its edge with her arms folded across her chest, looking at something he couldn't see. When he stepped out through the kitchen door, she heard him and turned. Joseph. I need to understand something. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside. Something in him knew the distinction mattered. The accounts you've corrected the wages. How did you fund it? The estate accounts were already strained. I know they were. A pause. I sold the Whitmore silver. He blinked. What? The silver service your grandmother left to the house. The formal set. The one that was never used. She said it without apology. I got £62 for it. That combined with what I redirected from the household decorating budget, the renovations you'd approved for the drawing room, was enough to make the first round of payments. He stood very still. The decorating budget was £14. It was listed as 40 in Edmund's accounts. She turned to look at him. I redirected the difference. £62 from silver, 26 recovered from a false budget line. £88 essentially from nothing to begin repairing what his negligence had allowed. Emily. His voice came out differently than he intended. Why didn't you wait? I could have. The men had waited 8 years. Her voice was perfectly calm. Their families had waited. Their children had grown up on less than they were owed. A pause. I didn't think they should wait for you to decide to come home. Something tightened in his chest. He didn't have a name for it immediately. He thought it might be shame. Real shame. Not the social embarrassment of being caught out. Not the irritation of a man whose plans hadn't gone as expected. The actual thing. The weight of it. What do you want? He asked. From me, now that I'm back. Emily looked at the garden for a moment. I want the wages fully restored by the end of the month. All of them. Every family on the estate. Every unpaid amount calculated to the penny. She paused. I want Edmund Vale removed from the accounts immediately. He may stay on in a supervised capacity if you choose, but he does not touch money again. And he could hear there was more. And I want it understood, she said quietly, that the decisions made in this house will not be made without me. Not the estate decisions, not the household decisions, not any decisions that affect the people who live and work here. She finally looked at him. I am not asking for a partnership, Joseph. I am telling you that I have already become one. Whether you accept that or not is the only question still in front of you. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze without flinching, without anger, without the hope that he recognized suddenly, and with a pang, as what used to live in her face whenever she looked at him. The hope was gone. He wasn't sure he could bring it back. He wasn't sure he deserved to try. But standing in the cold autumn air of the garden he had inherited and nearly lost. Joseph Hawthorne understood for the first time that the woman beside him had not been waiting for his return. She had been building something, and she had built it well enough that it would stand with or without him. And Miss Whitmore, he asked, although he already felt the answer settling into him like cold water. Emily looked at him steadily. That, she said, is a question only you can answer. She walked back toward the house. He stood in the garden alone, and for the first time in 6 months, he listened. The estate was very quiet, but it was not empty. Somewhere in the house, a woman he had dismissed for 8 years was running it with more competence and more dignity than he had ever managed. And the question she had left him with was not really about Clara Whitmore at all. It was about whether Joseph Hawthorne was willing to become the kind of man who deserved the home he had come back to. He didn't know yet. But the cold was sharp in the garden, and the house was warm, and the answer was waiting for him inside it. The morning after Joseph's return, Hawthorne Estate woke up the same way it had woken up for the past 6 months, without waiting for him. That was the thing he couldn't quite absorb. He had expected the house to exhale when he walked through the door, to reset itself around his presence the way it always had, servants orienting toward him, schedules bending to his habits, meals appearing at the hours he preferred. He was the master. That was how it worked. Instead, breakfast was served at 7, not 8:30. The kitchen staff operated on a schedule he didn't recognize. The morning reports, tenant updates, supply inventories. Correspondence from local merchants were stacked neatly on the writing desk in the small office off the library, where Emily apparently began her working day before he had even come downstairs. He stood in the doorway of that office at 7:30 and watched her read through a letter from a grain supplier with the focused attention of a woman who had been doing this for months. She had been doing this for months. "The Caldwell order," she said without looking up. "They've raised their winter price. I've already written back to Hargreaves Mill. They'll match the original rate if we commit by the 15th. Joseph leaned against the doorframe. "You've been handling the supply contracts." "Someone had to." She set the letter down and picked up the next one. Edmund was negotiating directly with Caldwell as a personal favor. They had an arrangement. I found the side correspondence in August. "How much did it cost us?" "Over 4 years, approximately £19 above market rate." A pause. "That's a conservative estimate." Howe was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything in this estate you haven't found your way into?" Emily looked up at him then. Not with triumph. With something quieter and more unsettling. The even gaze of a woman who understood exactly what she was saying. "The wine cellar," she said. "I left that alone. I didn't think it was worth the argument." For one startled moment, Joseph almost laughed. Almost. He came into the room instead and sat down in the chair across from her desk. The chair that had been placed, he now noticed at a slight angle from the desk, rather than directly in front of it. Not the supplicant's position. The colleague's. She had rearranged that chair deliberately. "I spoke with Edmund again this morning," Joseph said. "Early, before you came down." "I know, Mrs. Harmon mentioned it." Of course she did. He was beginning to understand that information moved through this house the way water moved through limestone, quietly, constantly finding every crack. "He's agreed to a full accounting review," Joseph said. "I've written to a solicitor in Coventry, a man I trust, to come and audit the books." Emily nodded. "Good. I want you present for the audit." She looked at him for a moment. "I will be present for the audit. Not thank you. Not I appreciate that. Simply a statement of fact. She was going to be there because it was her right to be there, and they both knew it." He rose from the chair. "There's something else." "There usually is." "Clara." He said it directly because he had decided somewhere in the cold of the garden the night before that indirection had cost him enough. "She'll be returning to London by the end of the week." Emily set her pen down very carefully. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not relief, not satisfaction, not the tearful gratitude he might have expected from another woman in another story. She looked at him the way she might look at a ledger that had finally balanced. Noting it. Moving on. "That's your decision to make," she said. "I know it is. I'm telling you because you deserve to know." A pause stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, not warm, simply honest. "Is she aware?" Emily asked. "I'll speak with her this morning." Emily looked down at her correspondence. "She won't take it gracefully." "No." He moved toward the door. "She never does anything ungracefully. That's rather the problem." He was almost through this door when she spoke again. "Joseph." He turned. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were on the letter in her hands. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness. I want to be clear about that." "I know. I'm not sure you do." Now she looked up. "You came home expecting to find a woman you could manage. You found a woman who had stopped needing to be managed. Those are very different situations, and I want you to understand which one you're actually in." He held her gaze. "I'm beginning to." She turned back to her work. He went to find Clara. Clara was in the East Wing sitting room with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking, and a view of the park she wasn't seeing. She had heard the early morning sounds of the house without understanding them. The purposeful footsteps, the quiet orders given, and quietly received the sense of a machine that had already run its first cycle before the sun had fully risen. She had understood in the dark of 3 in the morning that she had miscalculated. When Joseph came in and sat across from her and said what he said quietly, without ceremony, without cruelty, she listened to the whole of it without interrupting. She was not, as Emily had predicted, ungraceful. She was something worse than ungraceful. She was precise. "You came back for her," Clara said. "I came back for the estate. Don't lie to me. I've known you long enough." She set her teacup down. You came back and found something you didn't expect, and now you're standing here telling me the arrangement is over because you need to tell yourself it's not about her. Joseph said nothing. It is about her. Clara stood. She moved to the window, not to look at the view, but simply to have something to do with her body while she thought. I want you to know that I'm not surprised. I suspected when we arrived, when she looked at you from that staircase. A pause. She wasn't afraid of you. She was never afraid of me. No, but she used to need you. Clara turned from the window. She doesn't anymore. And you find that extraordinary, don't you? He looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said. Clara laughed. It was a short, unhappy sound. Honest, at last. She reached for her tea. I'll want the carriage by Thursday. I have nothing to pack that takes longer than a day. Clara. Don't. Her voice was cool, but not unkind. There's no version of what you could say now that doesn't make it worse. Go deal with your wife, Joseph. She's running your estate. The least you can do is not keep her waiting. He left. Clara stood at the window for a long time after the door closed. Then she sat back down, picked up her teacup, and began to drink it. It had gone cold. What nobody told the story of later was what happened in the kitchen. Not the grand confrontations, not the formal meetings in libraries, or the careful exchanges across writing desks. The kitchen where the real accounting of Hawthorne Estate had been happening since the first week of May. It was Margaret who had started it. She had arrived in late April, 3 weeks after Joseph's departure, with a bottle of wine and the look of a woman who intended to stay for dinner and possibly forever. She found Emily in the kitchen, because that was where Emily had gone when the silence of the upper rooms became too large to sit inside. You look terrible, Margaret had said, setting the wine on the kitchen table. Thank you, Margaret. You also look like you haven't slept. I haven't. Good. Margaret sat down across from her. Sleeping would have been a waste of time. Tell me what you know about the accounts. That was how it had started. Over the following weeks, Margaret came 3 times, then 4, then every week without announcement. She brought her own carriage and her own considerable intelligence and the specific ruthlessness of a woman who had managed her own estate since her husband's death and had never once needed a man to explain a ledger to her. They worked at the kitchen table. Not the library, not the study. The kitchen where the cook came in and out and occasionally offered opinions on which merchants could be trusted and which ones had been cheating the house for years. The cook's name was Agnes. She was 62 years old, had worked at Hawthorne for 4 decades, and had opinions about everything. The butcher on Marsh Street. Agnes had announced one morning, setting a pot of tea between Emily and Margaret with the finality of a verdict, has been billing for prime cuts and delivering second, every Tuesday for 3 years. Emily looked up from the ledger. You're certain? I'm the one cooking it, ma'am. I know what prime looks like, and I know what we've been getting. Agnes sat down uninvited in the 3rd chair at the table. Mr. Vale told me to keep quiet about it, said the discrepancy was accounted for elsewhere. A look passed between Emily and Margaret. What else have you kept quiet about? Margaret asked with the particular gentleness of a woman who understood that this was not a simple question. Agnes had answered for an hour, and that was when Emily began to understand that the problem with Hawthorne Estate was not merely Edmund Vale. Edmund Vale was a symptom. The problem was a house that had been run for years on the assumption that no one in authority was paying attention. Because no one in authority had been. Joseph had been in London pursuing his social ambitions and his passions. Emily had been told in 100 small and large ways that her attention was neither required nor welcome. And into that vacancy, the rot had spread, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way rot always spreads in old houses. Quietly, in the dark, in the places no one thought to check. Emily had started checking. She went to the tenant farms in the first week of June, on foot the first time because she hadn't wanted to make it an occasion. She walked the Northfield path in her second-best boots with a notebook and a pencil and no announcement of her arrival. Bram Hollis had been the first tenant to answer his door. He'd looked at her with a kind of careful blankness, the expression of a man who had learned that the appearance of a hawthorn on his doorstep Rarely led anywhere comfortable. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he had said. "Mr. Hollis." She'd held out the notebook. "I want to see your copy of your wage contract, the original if you have it." He hadn't moved for a moment. "Why?" "Because I've been looking at the estate accounts and the figures don't match what the contracts specify. I want to know if I'm reading the estate records wrong or if something else is wrong." Hollis had looked at her for a long time. Then he'd stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come in, ma'am." His wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, who kept her records in a tin box under the bed, with the precision of a person who had learned the hard way that paper was the only thing standing between her family and a dispute she couldn't win, had produced the contract within 2 minutes. The numbers hadn't matched, not by much on any single line, but across 4 years, £4 and 7 shillings short of what Bram Hollis's labor was worth. Emily had sat at the Hollis kitchen table and written down every figure. Ruth had watched her with an expression that moved slowly from suspicion to something more complicated. "You're actually going to do something," Ruth said. Not a question. More like a thing she was saying out loud to test whether it was real. "I'm going to try. People try things at this estate. Things mostly stay the same." "I know." Emily closed the notebook. "I'm the one who's going to have to live with that if I don't try hard enough." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "There's 5 other families on the North Field," she said finally. "I can have them at the church hall by Thursday if you want to talk to them all at once." Emily had not expected that. "Yes," she said. "Thursday would be very good." Thursday had turned into a 2-hour meeting in the cold church hall with 8 families, a notebook full of figures, and Agnes sitting in the back row because she had decided she was coming and no one had thought to argue with her. Emily had not made promises she couldn't keep. She had told them what she knew, what she didn't know, and what she intended to find out. She had told them it would take time, and that she couldn't guarantee outcomes, only effort. An older woman in the 3rd row, a tenant named Dorothy Marsh, who had been on the estate longer than most, had leaned forward and asked a question that made the room go still. "Does Mr. Hawthorne know you're here, ma'am?" "No," Emily said clearly. Silence. "And if he comes back?" Dorothy asked. "When he comes back," Emily corrected, "I'll have done enough that it won't matter whether he approves or not." The hall was very quiet. Then Dorothy Marsh nodded once with the slow decisiveness of a woman who had been waiting a long time to see something worth nodding at. That nod was worth more to Emily than anything Joseph had said to her in the last 3 years of their marriage. By the time Joseph came home in October, Emily had completed the full wage audit, drafted the correction schedule, replaced 2 estate suppliers who had been operating on unfavorable terms, arranged by Edmund, negotiated a better grain contract directly with a mill 20 miles east, arranged for the church hall to be used as a community meeting space for the estate workers on the first Sunday of each month, and paid the first round of wage corrections out of her own recovered funds. She had also, though this was not written in any ledger, managed to become something she had spent 8 years not being allowed to be. She had become someone people came to with problems. It started small. A tenant's child was sick, and the family couldn't afford the physician from town. Emily arranged for Dr. Weaver to extend a credit account against the estate repayable over a year. A dispute between 2 farm workers over a shared fence line was brought to her rather than to Edmund, and she'd resolved it in an afternoon by walking the boundary herself and ruling with a clarity that left both men satisfied, if not entirely delighted. A widow on the southern property had been paying a rate negotiated by her late husband that was now technically expired and subject to renegotiation. Emily extended it for another 2 years without raising the terms. None of it was dramatic. None of it made speeches. It simply was. Day after day, problem after problem, question after question. Emily Winthrop Hawthorne showed up and did the work, and the estate slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to work better. Margaret noticed it in September. "You're happy," she said, arriving on a Thursday with her usual bottle of wine, and the look of a woman making an observation she wasn't entirely sure how to feel about. Emily looked up from the correspondence. "I'm busy." "That's the same thing for you, apparently." "Is it?" "Yes." Margaret sat down. You're happy in a way I haven't seen since before you married him, and I want to say— She stopped, started again. I want to say that I think that's important, regardless of what happens when he comes back, regardless of what you decide about the marriage. What you've built here matters, Emily. It matters whether or not he ever acknowledges it. Emily was quiet for a moment. He'll come back and try to take credit for it, she said. Not bitterly, just factually. He'll try. Margaret poured the wine. Let him try. He tried, not deliberately, not consciously. But on his second full day back at Hawthorne, Joseph held a meeting with two of the senior tenant farmers, Hollis and a man named Peter Adams, from the eastern fields, and opened the conversation by saying that he had come back to address the estate's financial management personally, and that he intended to conduct a full review of the wage records. Hollis had looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Your wife's already done it, sir. Joseph paused. I'm aware. I meant, she's corrected the calculations. She's scheduled the payments. She's spoken to every family on the property. Hollis was not aggressive about it. He was simply stating facts the way a man states facts when he wants to be sure they're heard. We're not waiting on a review. We're waiting on the money. Joseph sat with that for a moment. The money will be there by the end of the month. Mrs. Hawthorne said the 15th. Another pause. Then the 15th. Adams, who had said nothing, spoke up then. He was a younger man, mid-30s, with careful eyes, and a way of sitting that suggested he chose his words the same way he chose his actions deliberately. Mr. Hawthorne. His voice was respectful and completely without warmth. I want to say something with your permission. Go ahead. When you left in the spring, some of the men thought, well, we thought things would get worse before they got better. An estate without its master present often suffers. He paused. Things got better. Joseph looked at him. We don't say that to embarrass you, sir. Adams continued. We say it because we want you to understand what you'd find if you actually looked. Your wife fixed things that had been broken for years. The people on this estate, your people, they know it. And we reckon you ought to know it too. The room was very quiet. Joseph looked at his hands on the table. I know it. Do you? Hollis again. Still not aggressive. Almost gentle in the way old men sometimes are when they're being entirely honest. Knowing a thing and feeling the weight of it are different animals, Mr. Hawthorne. I'd say you're still working toward the feeling. Joseph sat very still. He had spent the last 2 days absorbing information with the focused attention of a man trying to understand a situation that had moved past him. He had read the corrected ledgers. He had seen the correspondence. He had walked through the tenant records that Emily had organized in the estate office with a precision that made Edmund Vale's previous system look like a child's scrawl. He had known intellectually what she had done, now sitting across from 2 men who looked at him with the polite, firm patience of people who had already formed their opinion and were simply waiting to see whether he'd earn a different one. He began to feel it, and what he felt was not pride, though pride was in it somewhere. Mostly what he felt was the particular humiliation of a man who realizes he was the last person in a room to understand something that everyone else had already accepted as obvious. Clara left on Thursday. The carriage was loaded quietly early in the morning. Emily was in the estate office. Joseph stood at the front of the house. Clara came down the stairs in her traveling coat and paused at the bottom, looking at him with that characteristic composure that had once seemed so attractive and now seemed simply appropriate. The correct response to an incorrect situation. She won't forgive you easily, Clara said. No, but she might forgive you eventually. A pause. If you actually become worth forgiving. That's not a certainty. No. Something almost warm moved in her expression for a moment. But it's a possibility, which is more than you deserve. She picked up her gloves from the hall table. I'll want the reference letter for the Hargraves party in December. We needn't make an enemy of each other. Of course. Good. She pulled on her gloves. Goodbye, Joseph. She walked out of the house without looking back. He watched the carriage until it turned out of the drive. Then he went inside. He found Emily in the estate office exactly where she had been. She looked up when he came in, and the question in her face was quiet but clear. "She's gone." Emily nodded once. Then she looked back at the letter in her hands. He sat down in the angled chair across from her desk. She let him sit. She kept reading. A full minute passed in which the only sound was paper and the distant movement of the house around them. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Before I left for London, in the spring when you mentioned the accounts." He stopped. Tried again. "I didn't dismiss it because I thought you were wrong. I dismissed it because I didn't want to be here. I was already half gone in my head, and anything that required me to stay and attend to anything that was actually mine to attend to, I found a reason to brush aside." He looked at his hands. "I brushed aside a great deal." Emily set the letter down slowly. "That's not an apology," she said. "No, it's a confession. I'm not sure I've earned the right to make it an apology yet." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face that he hadn't seen before. Not tenderness exactly, not forgiveness, but the careful recognition of a person who has heard something real. Something that wasn't performance or strategy. "Margaret told me," Emily said quietly, "that you'd either come back a smaller version of yourself or a larger one. That there was no middle ground with a man like you." She paused. "She thought you'd come back smaller." Joseph was quiet. "And you?" Emily picked up her pen. Her eyes dropped back to the page. "I'm still deciding. It was not warm. It was not the beginning of reconciliation in any clean or comfortable sense. But it was honest, and it was real, and it was more than he had expected from the woman he had left standing in this house in the spring, thinking she would simply remain wherever he put her patient, and waiting, and unchanged. She had not remained. She had become something he was only beginning to know how to see. And the estate around him, his estate, his land, his inheritance, was running smoothly and justly, and with the kind of human dignity it had never possessed before, because the woman sitting across that desk had decided in his absence that it would. He didn't know yet what that made him. But he was beginning to understand that what it made her was something the history of Hawthorne Estate would remember long after it had forgotten the names of the men who owned it. He picked up the supply correspondence from the edge of her desk. "May I?" She glanced at the papers in his hand. "The Hargreave contract is on the 3rd page. The terms are already agreed. I just need a second signature." He turned to the 3rd page. He signed it without changing a word. He signed the contract without changing a word. That small act, the pen moving across the page, the signature settling beneath hers, meant something neither of them named out loud. It was not reconciliation. It was not trust restored. It was something more preliminary than both. It was a man accepting for the first time that another person's work did not require his correction before it could be considered done. Emily noticed. She said nothing. She folded the contract, set it with the outgoing correspondence, and moved to the next item on her desk. Joseph sat in the angled chair for another hour, reading through the supply records. She let him stay. She didn't explain things he hadn't asked about, and she didn't soften the numbers for his comfort. When he had questions, she answered them directly. When he had no questions, she didn't fill the silence. By the time he left the office, it was past noon, and the house smelled of the midday meal being prepared in the kitchen below. He walked down the corridor with the slow, deliberate pace of a man recalculating his position. He had been back 3 days, and in 3 days he had discovered that his estate manager had stolen from him for 8 years, that his wife had uncovered it without his help, that the woman he had brought home had miscalculated the situation entirely and left, and that every person on his property from Bram Hollis in the North Fields to Agnes in the kitchen had formed a loyalty to Emily that had nothing to do with him. He had thought when he climbed into that carriage in London that he was returning to a house that needed him. He was beginning to understand that the house had already decided it did not. What he hadn't understood yet, what was still assembling itself from pieces he didn't know were connected, was the rest of it. The part that Edmund Vale hadn't told him. The part that Clara had known and chosen not to share. That part arrived on Friday morning in the form of a letter. The solicitor from Coventry, A man named Gerald Ashworth, who had handled Hawthorne legal matters for 15 years, arrived 2 days ahead of schedule. He came not in response to Joseph's audit request, but in response to a separate letter, one he had received 3 weeks earlier before Joseph had even returned from London. He came because Emily had written to him in September. Joseph found out when he came downstairs Friday morning to find Ashworth already in the library seated across the desk from Emily, with a leather satchel open between them, 3 separate ledgers laid out in a row, and an expression on the solicitor's face that suggested he had not slept well. Joseph stopped in the doorway. Ashworth looked up. "Mr. Hawthorne, I expected you to still be in London." "I've been back 4 days." Joseph's eyes moved from the solicitor to his wife, Emily. "I wrote to Mr. Ashworth in September." She kept her voice even. "I needed a legal opinion on what I'd found. I wasn't sure at the time whether what Edmund was doing constituted fraud in the formal sense or simply mismanagement." And Joseph came into the room. He pulled the 3rd chair to the desk and sat without waiting to be invited. Ashworth cleared his throat. He was a careful man, the kind of careful that came from decades of handling other people's disasters with professional composure. But his hands, Joseph noticed, were very still on the desk. The stillness of a man controlling something. "It's fraud," Ashworth said, unambiguously. "The wage manipulation alone constitutes criminal misappropriation. But that—" He paused, and the pause had weight to it. "That is not the most significant finding." Joseph looked at him steadily. "Then tell me the most significant finding." Ashworth reached into the leather satchel and produced a document. Not a ledger, a letter. A single page folded twice with a broken seal at the bottom. He set it on the desk and slid it toward Joseph without touching it further, the way a man sets down something he'd prefer not to handle. Joseph picked it up. He read it once. Then he read it again. The room was very quiet. "This is Edmund's handwriting," Joseph said. "Yes." "This is addressed to William Whitmore." "Yes." He set it down. He did not look at Emily. He looked at Ashworth. "Clara's father." "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne." The letter was dated January of 1815, 2.5 years ago. In it, Edmund Vale described with a specificity that could only come from intimate knowledge the state of Hawthorne Estate's finances, the debt levels, the tenant contracts, the grain supply arrangements, the terms of the mortgage on the northern parcels. Information that had no business being in a private letter from an estate manager to a neighboring landowner. Information that would be extraordinarily useful to a man who was considering how best to position his daughter. Joseph put the letter on the desk. He pressed his palm flat against it. He breathed. "How did you find this?" His voice was quiet, controlled. The specific control of a man keeping something very large, very still. Emily answered without hesitation. "Agnes." He turned to look at her. "Agnes kept everything," Emily continued. 40 years in this house, and she never threw away a piece of paper that passed through her hands. She kept a box of correspondence she'd intercepted over the years, things that were left in rooms, things she'd been handed and told to burn, things she'd found in coat pockets when she was collecting for the laundry. A pause. "She brought me the box in October, after she decided I could be trusted with it." "After Agnes decided." Joseph repeated it slowly. "Yes." He stood up. He walked to the window, not to look out, just to move, because sitting still with what he'd just read felt physically impossible. He stood with his back to the room. Clara's father had known. He had known about the estate's finances from Edmund's private correspondence. He had known the specific vulnerabilities, the debt, the terms, the leverage points. And he had used that knowledge to position his daughter, to manufacture circumstances, to engineer proximity between his daughter and a wealthy landowner who was bored and flattered and had a wife he'd already begun to dismiss. Joseph had thought he fell in love with Clara. How was beginning to understand that he'd been guided there, carefully, with patience, by people who had read the map of his weaknesses before he'd even recognized he had them. "There's more." Ashworth's voice was steady. Joseph turned from the window. Ashworth produced a second document. A promissory note, dated March of 1816, between Edmund Vale and a Mr. Thomas Whitmore, Clara's brother. He set it on the desk. Edmund borrowed £300 from the Whitmore family. The note specifies that the loan is to be repaid from, and I'm reading directly now, future arrangements pertaining to the Hawthorne property. The silence in the room was absolute. Future arrangements. Joseph sat back down, slowly. What arrangements? Ashworth folded his hands on the desk. We believe, and Mrs. Hawthorne's analysis supports this, that Edmund Vale was for some period operating under an informal agreement with the Whitmore family. In exchange for his assistance in facilitating your relationship with Miss Clara Whitmore, he would receive financial relief from the Whitmore family and possibly a continued position at the estate if the property changed hands or management. If the property changed hands. Joseph heard those 4 words and felt something cold move through him from his chest to his hands. They were going to take the estate, he said. We believe they intended to position Miss Whitmore as the future legal mistress of Hawthorne, whether through remarriage, through inheritance arrangements, or through financial leverage once the estate's debts reached a critical point. Ashworth's voice never changed pitch. The debt situation, as you know, was becoming serious. If you had remained in London much longer with the current expenditure patterns, how long? Ashworth looked at the paper in front of him. 18 months. Perhaps 2 years at the outside. Joseph was silent for a long time. He thought about Clara in the carriage on the road back from London. Her confidence, her proprietary way of looking at the house when they arrived. He had attributed it to her natural manner, her ease with elegance, her comfort in fine surroundings. He had been an idiot. She knew, he said, not a question. Whether Miss Whitmore was fully informed of her father's and brother's arrangements with Edmund, we cannot say with certainty. Ashworth was careful, precise, lawyerly. What we can say is that her family's financial interest in Hawthorne Estate preceded your relationship with her by at least 2 years. She was not simply a woman you met at a party, Mr. Hawthorne. No. His voice was very flat. She wasn't. He looked at Emily. She had not moved. She had not shifted in her chair or changed her expression while Ashworth laid out the whole of it. She sat with her hands folded on the desk and her eyes on her husband with the composed attention of a woman who had already lived with this information for weeks. She had known since October. She had carried this for 6 weeks, this particular devastation, this proof that the man who abandoned her had been manipulated into doing it, and she had not written to him. She had not sent for him. She had not used it as a weapon or a bargaining chip. She had simply organized it, documented it, had it legally verified, and waited for him to come home. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He didn't try to correct it. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Because I needed it to be real first. Her voice was quiet and entirely honest. I needed it documented and verified and witnessed by a solicitor before it existed in any form that could be disputed. If I'd written to you in London with accusations against Clara's family and Edmund, you wouldn't have believed me. She paused. You would have thought I was a jealous wife inventing things. He couldn't argue with that. He had thought exactly that kind of thing about her before. He knew he had. And now, he asked. Now it's real, she said simply. Now it's in front of a solicitor and written into legal correspondence and provable in a court of law if it comes to that. She looked at Ashworth. It won't come to that, will it? It need not, Ashworth said carefully. Edmund's situation is clear. Criminal prosecution is possible. Civil recovery of the stolen wages is straightforward. The Whitmore matter is more complex. The promissory note is damning, but without direct evidence that Clara Whitmore herself participated in the scheme, rather than simply benefited from it, the legal options are limited. I'm not interested in Clara, Joseph said, and realized as he said it that it was completely true. He felt nothing about Clara at that moment, nothing angry, nothing sad, nothing wounded. The place where that feeling might have lived was occupied entirely by something colder and more focused. I'm interested in Edmund, and I'm interested in making certain the Whitmore family understands clearly that this estate is not available. That can be arranged, Ashworth said. How quickly? I can have the formal communication drafted by Monday. Do it. Joseph turned to Emily. Is there anything else in Agnes's box? Emily held his gaze. There was something moving behind her eyes, a reading, a measuring, the careful assessment of a woman deciding how much further to go. Yes, she said. He waited. She reached into the drawer of her desk and produced a smaller document, a single folded note more worn than the others, as though it had been read many times before being put away. She set it on the desk in front of him. He picked it up. It was a note in Edmund's handwriting, shorter than the others, undated. It said, "The wife suspects. Keep her occupied. The usual approach should suffice." 3 lines. Joseph read them twice. "The usual approach," he repeated. Emily looked at him steadily. "We believe Edmund was responsible for a series of incidents in 1815 and 1816 that kept me occupied. The household accounts were deliberately complicated in ways that required hours of my attention to resolve. Supplier disputes arrived in clusters that seemed designed to consume time. 2 of my correspondence letters to Margaret were intercepted and delayed. Margaret's replies arrived weeks late, which I attributed to the post." A pause. It wasn't the post. The coldness in Joseph's chest spread outward until his hands felt numb. "He was managing you," he said, "to keep you from managing the estate." "He was managing both of us," Emily said quietly. "You with flattery and access to a beautiful woman and freedom from responsibility. Me with manufactured busyness and isolation." She looked at the table. "He was very good at it." Joseph set the note down. He didn't push it back toward Ashworth. He left it where it was in the center of the desk between himself and his wife. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yes." Emily's voice didn't soften. "You do. Not just for leaving." He looked at her directly. "For being the kind of man who could be managed like that. For being so absent. From my own life, my own estate, my own marriage. For being so thoroughly convinced that my comfort mattered more than everything that actually mattered. I made it easy for him. I handed it to him." He stopped, swallowed. "I handed it to him, and you paid for it." The room was very quiet. Ashworth made a quiet, small movement with his pen that seemed to be an attempt to remind them he was present without intruding. Emily looked at her husband for a long time. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 8 years, she said at last. He didn't flinch. "I know. I'm not forgiving you today. I know that too. I want you to understand that what I did here, the accounts, the tenants, the contracts, the legal work, none of it was done to prove something to you. You weren't here. I didn't do it for your eventual approval." Her voice was firm and completely clear. "I did it because it was right, and because these were my people, and because someone had to. I understand that. Do you?" She leaned forward very slightly. "Because understanding that means accepting that I didn't need you to come back for any of it to get done. It means accepting that your presence here is not necessary. It's optional." A beat. "If you stay, it will be because you choose to build something worth staying for. Not because this estate requires your name on the deed. It doesn't need your name. It needs your commitment." Ashworth was definitely looking at his papers now, with studied concentration. Joseph sat with that for a long, honest moment. "What would that look like?" he asked. "Commitment in your terms." Emily leaned back. "Edmund is dismissed by end of day today, not at the end of the week. Today. His personal effects will be collected, his final wages calculated honestly, not a penny more, not a penny less than what he's owed, and he will leave this property before dark. Done. The full wage restoration, every family, every unpaid amount is complete by the 15th, not end of the month, the 15th. Done. You will attend the first Sunday meeting at the church hall, not to speak, to listen. The estate workers meet there to raise concerns and discuss what's working and what isn't. You will sit in the back, and you will not interrupt, and you will not offer solutions unless specifically asked." He blinked. "You've established a workers' meeting, every first Sunday since July." A pause. "It was Agnes's idea originally. I refined it." He was quiet for a moment. "Of course it was Agnes's idea." Something flickered at the edge of Emily's mouth. Not quite a smile. the possibility of one. "Is there more?" he asked. "Yes, but that's enough for today." She began gathering the documents on her desk, organizing them with her characteristic precision. "I want those 3 items handled before I consider anything else." Joseph stood. He looked at Ashworth. "Draft the Edmund dismissal papers today. I want them ready within the hour." Ashworth nodded and reached for his pen. Joseph looked back at Emily. She was already reading the next item in her correspondence stack. He stood there for a moment, not because he had more to say, but because the act of leaving felt like something that needed to be deliberate. Not a retreat. A choice. "Emily." She looked up. "I'm sorry for making it easy for him." She held his gaze, said nothing. He left. Edmund Vale received the dismissal papers at 3 in the afternoon. Joseph delivered them personally without preamble into the estate office where Edmund had been waiting with the particular anxious patience of a man who understood that the ground was shifting and was trying to calculate the direction of the fall. He read the papers. His face went through several changes, surprise calculation, and then finally something that looked almost like relief. "The criminal matter," Edmund began, "is between you and the solicitor." Joseph's voice was flat. "Mrs. Hawthorne has agreed not to pursue formal prosecution if the full amount is repaid to the estate over a period to be determined by Ashworth. You will cooperate fully with the audit. You will answer every question put to you by the solicitor truthfully. You will confirm in writing the nature of your correspondence with the Whitmore family." Edmund went still. "How much do you know?" "Everything." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Edmund set the dismissal papers down on the desk. He straightened them with his fingertips, a small compulsive gesture of the meticulous man he was even now. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I never intended the estate to fail. What I did with the wages, I told myself it was small, that it wouldn't matter in the larger picture. It mattered." Joseph kept his voice even with effort. "It mattered to Bram Hollis's family. It mattered to Dorothy Marsh. It mattered to 8 families who received less than they were owed for years while you decided it was small." Edmund was quiet. "And the Whitmore arrangement. They approached me." Edmund's voice dropped. "William Whitmore. He came to me in 1814 after he heard of your situation at a county dinner. He said he was looking to invest in estates with management difficulties. He had capital and was looking for opportunities. He said if I could facilitate." He stopped. "I needed the money, my own debts. I told myself it was harmless, that you'd simply meet someone, fall in love as men do, that nothing formal would ever come of it. But it did come of something. More than I expected." Edmund's voice was very low now. "When you actually left, when you actually went to London with her, I realized what I'd set in motion. I tried to slow it down. The letter to Mrs. Hawthorne, the one telling her you'd been delayed." Joseph went very still. "What letter?" Edmund looked up. "What letter?" Joseph repeated, and his voice had changed in a way that made Edmund press back slightly in his chair. "In April." Edmund's throat moved. "When you told me you were going to London and you'd return within the month, I wrote to Mrs. Hawthorne on your behalf. You'd asked me to handle the correspondence. The letter I sent was not what you'd instructed." The cold was back. "What did it say?" "It said you had decided to extend your time in London indefinitely, that arrangements were being made." Edmund's voice was barely above a murmur. "That she should not expect your return." Joseph stood absolutely motionless. He had left for London expecting to be back within the month. He had told Edmund to write to Emily with an expected return date. He had assumed Emily knew he'd intended to come back. That his absence had stretched into months was, he had told himself, a matter of circumstances. Of London drawing him longer than planned. Of 1 week becoming 2, becoming 10. He had never questioned whether Emily had been told something different. She had been told in his name that he wasn't coming back. She had spent months not with the hope of his return, softening the edges of her work, but with the explicit knowledge handed to her in what she believed was his own hand that she had been discarded. And she had still fixed his estate. She had still protected his tenants. She had still organized, audited, corrected, and rebuilt the thing he had walked away from. Not for him. She had made that clear. Not waiting for him, not in hopes of his eventual gratitude. Because it was right. Joseph put both hands flat on the desk and looked at Edmund Vale with an expression that made the older man lean back another inch. "Get out of my house," he said. Edmund got out. He found Emily in this kitchen garden again. He was beginning to understand that was where she went when she needed air. Not the formal gardens, not the walk along the eastern fence that had been his preferred route for years. The kitchen garden. Practical, purposeful, undecorated. She turned when she heard his step. Whatever she saw in his face made her go still. "He told you about the letter," she said. Not a question. "You knew." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You've known since August." She held his gaze without flinching. "I found the copy in Edmund's correspondence files. He'd kept a copy. Men like Edmund always keep copies." "Emily, don't." Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him completely. "Don't apologize for that yet. I need you to understand something first." She came toward him slowly until she was close enough that he could see the exact steadiness in her eyes. The thing that wasn't coldness, he now understood, but something harder to achieve than coldness. Clarity. "I got that letter in April. I read it, and I had two choices. I could wait for you for some correction for the world to rearrange itself into something more bearable. Or I could go to work." She stopped in front of him. "I went to work. And I want you to understand that I will never again arrange my life around waiting for you to decide to show up. That is finished. That version of me is finished." I was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 8 years of marriage. She had seen charm there, and impatience, and the particular social warmth he wore in company. She had seen dismissal and distraction. She had once long ago seen something that might have been genuine feeling. What was on his face now was none of those things. It was grief. Clean, undefended, honest grief. The grief of a man fully present to the cost of his own choices. "I know," he said. His voice was rough around the edges. "I know that version of you is finished. I'm not asking for her back." She looked at him. "Then what are you asking for?" He was quiet for a long moment. "A chance," he said. "To become someone worth standing beside. Not to be forgiven. Not to go back. Just—" He stopped. Started again. "I want to know if there's anything left to build. Between us. Not what we had, I understand, that's gone. Something different. Something that starts from what's true." He looked at her. "I don't know if you want that. I don't know if you should want it. But I needed to ask." The garden was very quiet around them. Emily looked at him for a long time. "Ask me again in the spring," she said at last. He blinked. "You'll have had 6 months by then," she said. "The same 6 months I had alone. Use them the way I used mine." She turned back toward the house. "Show me what you do with them." She walked inside. Joseph stood in the kitchen garden and listened to the quiet of the estate around him, the distant sounds of the farm, the particular orderly rhythm of a household that had learned to run honestly and understood that he had just been given something extraordinarily rare. Not forgiveness, not absolution, a starting line. He had no idea yet whether he was capable of running the race, but the cold air was sharp and the ground beneath his feet was solid, and somewhere in that house a woman was already back at her desk, and the only thing left was to decide what kind of man was going to walk through that door in the morning. He walked through that door the next morning at 6:30. Not because Emily was watching. She wasn't. She was already in the estate office with her correspondence and her corrected ledgers and her systematic, unhurried competence. He walked through the door at 6:30 because he had lain awake until 4 in the morning, deciding what kind of man was going to do it, and he had finally arrived at an answer that didn't make him feel like a fraud. He went to the stables first, not to ride. He went to find Thomas Wick, the head groom, who had worked at Hawthorne for 12 years and whose wage records, when Emily had cross-referenced them, showed a systematic shortfall of nearly £7 across 3 years. Joseph had read that number in the corrected ledger 2 days ago. He had processed it as a figure. He had not yet processed it as a man. Thomas was in the far stall when Joseph came in. He heard the footstep, looked up, and did what servants did, arranged his face into careful neutrality, and waited. "Thomas?" Joseph stopped at the stall door. "I owe you £7 and 4 shillings. Thomas Wick looked at him without expression. "Mrs. Hawthorne has it in the schedule, sir. The 15th. "I know she does." Joseph reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "I'm not waiting for the 15th. Thomas didn't move for a moment. He looked at the envelope with the particular caution of a man who had learned that gifts from landlords often came with strings attached in places you couldn't see until they pulled tight. "Take it, Thomas." Joseph set it on the stall door. "It's what you were owed. Nothing more, nothing less. No conditions." Thomas took the envelope. He opened it, counted it with the unhurried precision of a man who had been cheated before and wasn't going to be embarrassed about making sure. Then he folded it and put it in his coat. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne." It was not warm. It was not forgiving. It was the acknowledgement of a debt paid, and nothing beyond that. Joseph received it exactly as it was given. He spent the rest of that morning doing the same thing, one person at a time, before the scheduled payments went out on the 15th. The young footman who'd been underpaid for his first 2 years. The laundrywoman whose contract had been quietly amended downward without her signature. The groundskeeper whose quarterly bonus had been recorded as paid and never delivered. He didn't make speeches. He brought the envelope and said what he owed and left. By midday word had moved through the house. The way word always moved through houses, faster than fire and quieter than water. Agnes knew before he reached the kitchen. She was standing at the stove with her back to him when he came in, and she said without turning around, "Sit down, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll make you something to eat." He sat at the kitchen table. She set a bowl of soup in front of him and sat down across from him with her own cup of tea and the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time to have this particular conversation. "She's not going to make it easy," Agnes said. "I know. She shouldn't make it easy." Agnes wrapped both hands around her cup. "She made everything easy for years, and look what it got her." A pause. "You took her for a fixed thing, like the walls or the floors, something that would always be exactly where you left it." He looked at the soup. "Yes, and now you've found out she wasn't a fixed thing. She was a person." Agnes looked at him steadily. "The question is whether you actually understand that, or whether you're just saying the right words until she forgives you, and then you go back to the way things were." Joseph looked up. "I can't go back to the way things were." "Why not?" He thought about it. Really thought about it instead of producing the answer that sounded best. "Because the way things were," he said slowly, "required me to believe she was less than she is, and I know better now. I can't unknow it." Agnes regarded him for a long moment. "Eat your soup," she said finally. "You're going to need the energy. You've got a county meeting Thursday." He looked up sharply. "What county meeting?" "The autumn landowners gathering at Alderton Hall." Agnes picked up her tea. "Lord Alderton hosts it every year, all the neighboring estates. You've attended every year for 15 years. "I know the meeting. What about it?" "Words traveled," Agnes said simply. "About Edmund, about Miss Whitmore, about the wage problems." She met his eyes. "About Mrs. Hawthorne." The soup was very hot. He set down the spoon. "How much word?" "Enough." Agnes paused. "Lord Pemberton's housekeeper is Dorothy Marsh's sister-in-law. The Caldwell family, the grain merchants, they supply 4 other estates in the county, and Margaret Ellison talks to everyone." A beat. "Everyone knows Mr. Hawthorne. The only question is whether you're going to walk into that meeting room Thursday and let them see a man who's ashamed or a man who's doing something about it." He sat very still. "She should come with you," Agnes said. "To the meeting, Mrs. Hawthorne. If you go alone, it looks like you're managing a scandal. If you go together, it looks like something else." "She won't go to protect my reputation." "No." Agnes set down her cup. "But she might go to protect the estates. They're not the same thing anymore, Mr. Hawthorne. You should know that." He did know it. He was learning it new every hour. He finished the soup. He thanked Agnes in a way that he hoped conveyed that he understood the conversation had been more than culinary. She received it with a brief nod and went back to her work. He went to find his wife. She was in the tenant records room, a small room off the main corridor that had been a storage closet until apparently Emily had cleared it out in June and turned it into a functional archive. He stood in the doorway and took in the organized shelves, the labeled boxes, the filing system that had no precedent in anything Edmund Vale had maintained. She was cross-referencing 2 documents on the work table when he came in. She glanced up and kept working. "The county meeting Thursday," he said. "I know about it. Agnes suggested you come." Emily set one document down and picked up another. "Agnes suggests many things. She's usually right. She's almost always right." A pause. "What's your reason for wanting me there?" He came into the room. He leaned against the shelving across from the work table, not crowding her, giving her space to keep working while they talked. He'd noticed she thought better when her hands were occupied. He'd noticed that 3 days ago and stored it away without examining why he was storing it. "Because it's your estate as much as mine," he said. "Because whatever people are saying about Hawthorne, and apparently they're saying quite a bit, you're the reason it's still standing. You deserve to be in that room." She looked up at him. "And," he added, "because I think if I walk in there alone, Lord Pemberton is going to say something about the wage situation that I won't handle well, and I'd rather have you beside me when I'm trying not to handle things badly." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not softness, but a kind of recognition, the acknowledgement of an honest answer. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He turned to go. "Joseph." He turned back. She was looking at the document in her hands, not at him. "Pemberton will be the worst of them. He's been waiting for an opportunity to diminish this estate for 20 years. His land borders our northern fields, and he's wanted that parcel since before your father died." She set the document down. "Don't let him turn the wage situation into a referendum on your fitness to hold the property. They're separate matters, and he'll try to make them the same." He looked at her for a moment. "What would you do," he asked, "if he tries?" Emily finally looked up. "I'd put the corrected ledgers on the table and invite every man in the room to compare his estate's wage records with mine and see whose are more defensible." He almost smiled. "That's exactly what you'd do." "Yes." She picked up her pen. "It's also what you should do." He left the room with something unfamiliar in his chest, something that had the general weight of gratitude but was more specific than that. More particular. The feeling of being helped by someone who had every reason not to help him, and choosing not to examine too closely why they still did. Tuesday arrived with a complication no one had anticipated. Lord Pemberton arrived at Hawthorne Estate at 10 in the morning, unannounced, in a carriage that looked deliberately imposing. He was 63 years old, broad in the chest, with the ruddy confidence of a man who had never in his life been made to feel small and had organized his entire existence around ensuring it stayed that way. He asked for Joseph. Joseph was in the North Fields. The footman, the young man whose back wages Joseph had personally delivered the morning before, came to find him with the particular urgency of a young person who understands that something important is happening, but isn't sure which way it's going to fall. By the time Joseph came back to the house, Lord Pemberton had been shown into the drawing room, where he had apparently been waiting long enough to begin remarking on the furniture to the housemaid who'd brought his tea. He looked up when Joseph entered with the expression of a man who had timed his arrival precisely to catch another man off balance. "Hawthorne." Pemberton rose but didn't extend his hand, a small discourtesy precise and intentional. "I thought I'd come before Thursday. Save us both the awkwardness of a public conversation." "That's considerate of you." Joseph sat. He did not apologize for keeping the man waiting. "What can I do for you, Pemberton? I'll be direct." Pemberton settled back in his chair with the ease of a man who owned the room he was sitting in, regardless of whose name was on the deed. "There's talk in the county, about your manager, about your arrangements in London, about the wage situation with your tenants." He paused. Some people are suggesting that Hawthorne Estate has been mishandled. Some people are correct. Joseph's voice was even. It was mishandled. For years by a manager I trusted without sufficient oversight. I've addressed it. Pemberton blinked. He had prepared for defensiveness. He had not prepared for agreement. Well, he recalibrated. Yes. But the question being raised, and I raise it as a neighbor, you understand, not as an adversary, is whether the estate is financially stable enough to continue independent operation. Given the accumulated... The estate is stable. Joseph kept his voice level. The accounts have been fully audited. The wage debts are being repaid. The supplier contracts have been renegotiated. The Northern mortgage payments are current. The Northern mortgage. Pemberton's expression sharpened very slightly. Yes. I had heard there might be difficulties there. If you were ever in a position where you needed capital support or a reliable buyer for the Northern parcel, the Northern parcel isn't for sale. Joseph looked at him directly. It's never been for sale, and if it were, I wouldn't begin the conversation by pretending it was a courtesy call. Pemberton's face shifted. The geniality thinned. Joseph. His voice dropped into the register of a man speaking confidentially to another man. One landlord to another, the register that excludes everyone else from the room. Between us, man to man, your wife has been active, very active, in matters that are properly your concern. People are talking about that too. A woman running accounts meeting with tenants renegotiating contracts. She's been running the estate, Joseph said, while I was absent, which was my failure, not hers. He held Pemberton's gaze. And she's been running it better than I did. Pemberton stared at him. The corrected ledgers are available for review if you'd like to compare management practices. Joseph continued in exactly the tone Emily had prescribed. I'd be happy to put them on the table Thursday. The door opened. Emily came in. She hadn't been summoned. She had simply appeared with the composed authority of a woman who had heard enough through the corridor wall to decide that the conversation required her presence. She was in a dark blue day dress. Her hair simply arranged a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Lord Pemberton. Her voice was courteous and entirely without warmth. I didn't realize you'd arrived. I hope Joseph has been looking after you. Pemberton rose. He had manners, you couldn't take those away from him. Mrs. Hawthorne. Please sit. She sat herself in the chair beside Joseph's. Not behind him, not at a distance. Beside him. She set the portfolio on her knee. I understand we were discussing the estate accounts. Pemberton looked from her to Joseph and back. We were discussing, he began, the Northern parcel. Emily opened the portfolio. I have the mortgage documents here if you'd like to review the payment history. Fully current, as Joseph mentioned. She laid them on the table between them, as casually as one might set out a deck of cards. I also have the new Hargreave grain contract, the restated wage records, and the supplier audit summary. I bring them everywhere lately. People seem to have questions. A pause that landed with surgical precision. Was there something specific you were hoping to understand? Pemberton looked at the documents. He looked at Emily. He looked at Joseph, who was looking at Emily with an expression that Pemberton could not entirely categorize, but that made him, for the first time in the conversation, feel that he had wandered into a room that was more occupied than he'd realized. No. Pemberton cleared his throat. No, I think I've gotten a clear enough picture. Wonderful. Emily closed the portfolio. We'll see you Thursday then. I'm bringing the full account summary to the gathering. I thought the other landowners might find it useful as a model for estate auditing practices. She smiled at him. The smile of a woman who had just won a skirmish so cleanly, the other person wasn't entirely sure it had happened. Transparency is so important among neighbors, don't you think? Pemberton left 12 minutes later. The moment. The front door closed, Joseph turned to look at his wife. She was already tucking the portfolio back under her arm. You were listening at the door, he said. I was in the corridor reviewing the mortgage documents, she said. Sound travels. She moved toward the door. You were handling it well for what it's worth. He turned in his chair. Emily. She paused. Thank you. She looked at him for a moment. Not long. Just enough. Don't thank me, she said. That was for the estate. She left. He sat in the drawing room for a moment, looking at the space she'd occupied. Then he stood and went back to work. Thursday arrived with the particular cold clarity of a late October morning, and they rode to Alderton Hall together in the Hawthorne carriage, with Margaret Ellison seated across from them, because Margaret had invited herself with the efficiency of a woman who understood that her presence at this particular event was non-negotiable. The ride was mostly quiet. Margaret read a letter. Emily reviewed notes in a small book. Joseph looked at the road and thought about what Agnes had said, a man who's ashamed versus a man who's doing something about it, and tried to locate which one he currently was. He thought the answer was somewhere between. He hoped by the end of the day to have moved further toward the second. Alderton Hall was large and cold and full of people who had all had 3 days to discuss the same thing and were exercising varying degrees of subtlety about it. The county landowners. 14 families, represented mostly by their male heads with several wives in attendance, arranged themselves in the great hall with the practiced social geometry of people who understood that where you stood in a room communicated almost as much as what you said in it. Joseph felt the shift the moment they walked in. The particular quality of attention that descends on a room when the person everyone has been talking about finally arrives in the flesh. Conversations didn't stop. They modulated, became slightly more careful. Eyes moved and quickly moved away. He had expected that. He had not expected Lord Alderton to cross the room to greet them within 30 seconds of their arrival, hand-extended expression genuinely warm. Hawthorne. Alderton shook his hand firmly. Mrs. Hawthorne. He turned to Emily and bowed with the particular sincerity of a man who meant it. I understand you've been doing remarkable work. Emily inclined her head. The work needed doing. Indeed it did. Alderton looked between them with the satisfied expression of a man who had formed an opinion and found it confirmed. Come, I want to introduce you to Harrington. He's been having difficulties with his accounts manager, and I think your approach might interest him enormously. He walked them into the room, not around its edges, but directly through its center, which was either a gift or a gamble, and turned out to be both. 3 conversations happened in the next hour that mattered. The first was with Lord Harrington, a quiet man in his 50s, whose accounts difficulties were emerged eerily similar to what Hawthorne had experienced. Systematic small misappropriations, compounding over years. Invisible in any single ledger page, but devastating in aggregate. Emily sat with him for 20 minutes and walked him through the audit methodology she and Margaret had developed, while his wife took notes, and Harrington himself alternated between relief and mortification. By the end of it, he had asked Emily to recommend a solicitor. She recommended Ashworth. The second was with Sir Philip Crane, a landowner from the Southern District, who approached Joseph directly with the targeted confidence of a man carrying news he couldn't wait to share. Heard about your London situation, Crane said in the man-to-man register that Pemberton had also attempted. Sorry business. Clara Whitmore, her father's reputation, you know. People have been saying for years that William Whitmore plays a longer game than he lets on. He lowered his voice. You weren't the first is the thing. There was a situation in Derbyshire 3 years ago. Different family, similar approach. Didn't end well for them. Joseph looked at him carefully. What happened in Derbyshire? Estate went to mortgage. The Whitmore family bought the debt. Crane looked at him steadily. You were lucky, Hawthorne. Or rather, his eyes moved briefly across the room to where Emily was seated with Harrington. Your wife was lucky, or whatever the right word is for when someone is very good at their work. Capable, Joseph said. The right word is capable. Crane raised his glass very slightly. Quite right, capable. The third conversation was the one Joseph had been preparing for. Pemberton caught him near the fire at the far end of the hall, in the deliberate way of a man who had positioned himself there and waited. He was with 2 other landowners, Moss and Farwell, both of whom had neighboring properties, and shared Pemberton's general view that the county would run better if fewer people in it were allowed to make decisions that affected them. Hawthorne. Pemberton's voice was social now, the confrontational edge smoothed over. We were discussing the tenant situation, the wage restorations. Good subject. Joseph stopped. He did not move away from the fire. He held his ground in the physical sense because he had learned somewhere in the last week that physical positioning mattered more than he had ever credited. What about them? It sets a precedent, Mosse said. He was thin-faced and precise, the kind of man who said sets a precedent as though it were a self-evident problem. If landowners begin restoring wages on the basis of historical contract discrepancies, then estates that have been paying their people honestly have nothing to worry about. Joseph kept his voice pleasant. And estates that haven't should be concerned. Yes, that seems like the right state of affairs. Farwell cleared his throat. It's more complicated than... It isn't actually. Joseph turned to look at him directly. A contract is a contract. A wage promised is a wage owed. The complication only arises if you've been telling yourself that complicated bookkeeping makes a debt not a debt. He paused. I told myself that for 8 years by proxy. I'm done telling myself that. The fire crackled. Pemberton looked at him with the expression of a man recalculating. You've changed your tune, Hawthorne, Pemberton said finally. Yes. Joseph looked at him. I was wrong. About a great many things. I find that admitting it is faster than defending it. Across the room, Emily glanced from her conversation with Harrington. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She looked back at Harrington. That fraction of a second was enough. He turned back to Pemberton, and the conversation moved on, and for the rest of the gathering, the particular quality of attention in the room shifted again. Not the careful modulation of people watching a scandal, but something more complicated. The reassessment. The slow reconfiguration of social standing that happens when a story people thought they understood turns out to have a different shape than they assumed. They left Alderton Hall at 4. Margaret, with the social intuition of a woman who understood when 3 was a crowd, announced that she had letters to write and retreated to the forward-facing seat of the carriage, where she proceeded to read with great apparent absorption for the entirety of the ride home. Joseph and Emily sat across from each other in the dimming afternoon light. They were quiet for a long time. Harrington, Emily said eventually. He's going to need significant help. His situation is more advanced than ours was. Ours. The word was out before Joseph could examine it. He felt immediately uncertain about having said it. Emily didn't react to the word. She looked at the passing road. The Whitmore connection, what Crane told you about Derbyshire. Did he have names? He did. I'll write to the Derbyshire family this week, if they're willing to formalize their account of what happened. Ashworth thinks it strengthens the position against the Whitmore family significantly. Not criminally, William Whitmore is careful, but enough to make further ventures into county estates less appealing. Emily was quiet for a moment. Clara, she said, not accusatory, simply naming the thing. I don't know how much she knew, Joseph said. I may never know, but it doesn't change what I did. Whatever her family arranged, I was still a man who wanted to be arranged, who made it easy. He looked out the window. I keep coming back to that. Don't, Emily said. He turned to look at her. Don't spend the next year flagellating yourself over being manipulated, she said. Her voice was direct and unsentimental, the voice she used for ledger figures and contract terms. It doesn't serve anyone. Learn from it and move forward. The tenants don't need your guilt. They need their wages and a landlord who pays attention. She looked at him steadily. That's all anyone on that estate needs. Your attention consistently given over time. That's it. He looked at her. You're remarkably practical, he said. I've had to be. I know. He paused. I'm sorry for that too. She looked at the road. Margaret turned a page. The carriage moved through the fading afternoon. Thursday went better than I expected, Emily said after a moment. Because of you. Walking into Harrington's conversation the way you did. I was interested in his situation. Emily. He waited until she looked at him. I know. I'm not attributing it to strategy. I'm saying that you walking into that room with the portfolio under your arm, the way you sat down with Harrington, like it was the most natural thing in the world, people noticed. Not because it was unusual for a capable woman to handle estate accounts. but because you were so entirely undefensive about it. Like you had nothing to prove. She was quiet for a moment. I don't, she said simply. No. He held her gaze. You don't. Something passed between them then. Not warmth exactly, not reconciliation, but an honesty so complete it occupied the space that both of those things would eventually need to fill. Margaret turned another page. The carriage rolled on toward Hawthorne, and in the quiet between them, something old and damaged had begun very tentatively, very carefully, without ceremony or announcement, to become the raw material of something else. Something that didn't have a name yet. Something that would take months to determine the shape of. Something that had started as most real things do not, with a grand moment, but with a man going to the stables at 6:30 in the morning, with an envelope in his coat, and the slow, difficult willingness to begin. The estate came into view as the sun finished its descent behind the tree line. Emily looked at it through the carriage window. She looked at it the way she had not looked at it since before Joseph left. Not as a burden, not as a problem, but as a place that was genuinely hers. That she had genuinely made something of. That would remember in its stones and its accounts and the quiet loyalty of the people who worked it that someone had decided it was worth fighting for. She looked at it and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She felt at home. The carriage rolled through the Hawthorne gates as the last color left the sky, and by the time the wheels stopped on the front drive, the house was already lit from within. Lamps in every window. Smoke from the kitchen chimneys, the particular warm geometry of a house that functioned whether or not its master was present to witness it. Joseph stepped down first and offered his hand. Emily took it. Not because she needed it. The step was not difficult. She took it because she chose to, and they both understood the distinction, and neither of them said a word about it. Margaret descended behind them with the satisfied expression of a woman who had observed something important and was keeping it entirely to herself. Thursday, she announced, pulling on her gloves. I'd call that a success. You'd call a moderate success, a triumph and a disaster, a learning experience, Emily said. That is correct. Margaret kissed her cheek. Good night, Emily. Good night, Joseph. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating precision she usually reserved for estate ledgers. Better, she said simply, and climbed back into her own waiting carriage. They stood on the drive as Margaret's carriage departed. The night was very still around them. Joseph became aware in that stillness that he and Emily were standing closer than they had stood since before he left for London, close enough that he could hear her exhale. She stepped toward the house first. He followed. November came in cold and steady, and Joseph Hawthorne discovered that rebuilding something you had broken was nothing like building something from scratch. Building from scratch had a certain romance to it. The clean beginning, the unmarked page, the luxury of making your first impression instead of correcting your last one. Rebuilding was slower and more honest. It happened in increments so small they were almost invisible. A conversation in the corridor that didn't end in withdrawal. A question asked and answered without the old layered silence underneath it. A shared meal where the quiet between them was no longer the quiet of two people avoiding something, but simply the quiet of two people occupying the same space. I went to the Sunday meeting in November, as Emily had required. He sat in the back of the church hall on a wooden chair that was marginally too small for him, and he listened for 2 hours while Agnes moderated a discussion about the kitchen garden expansion, and Bram Hollis raised a concern about the drainage on the Northfield boundary, and Dorothy Marsh proposed that the church hall be made available for a winter school for the estate children on Wednesday afternoons. He said nothing. He had promised Emily he would say nothing unless asked. He was not asked. But on the ride back to the estate, sitting beside Emily in the smaller gig she used for local travel, he turned and said, Dorothy Marsh's school idea, the Wednesday afternoons. How would she fund it? Emily kept her eyes on the road. She'd been hoping the estate would contribute. She hasn't asked formally. She shouldn't have to ask formally. He thought for a moment. Agnes could provide the midday meal. It's not a large expense. The hall is already available. A pause. I can put it to Dorothy at the next meeting, Emily said carefully. Or I could speak with her directly, if that wouldn't undermine your process. Emily glanced at him. It wouldn't undermine it. It would be unusual. She's not accustomed to you approaching her directly. I know. He looked at the road. I'm trying to become someone she could be accustomed to. Emily was quiet for a moment. I'll introduce you properly, she said at last. At the December meeting. Don't go alone yet. It'll read as performance if you arrive without context. Let her see the pattern first. He nodded. All right. And Joseph. She kept her eyes forward. The school idea is hers. If it gets implemented, her name goes on it. Not yours, not the estate's. Of course. She glanced at him again. Whatever she was checking for, she appeared to find it. They rode the rest of the way in the quiet that had slowly over the course of November begun to feel like something other than distance. The letter from William Whitmore arrived on the 14th of November, 3 days before the wage restoration was completed. It was addressed to Joseph. It arrived in the Morning Post with the careful handwriting of a man who had spent 50 years communicating primarily through lawyers and proxies. It was 2 pages long and composed in the language of civility, perfectly polite, precisely structured, and absolutely threatening in every implication. Whitmore expressed his hope that any misunderstanding between their families might be resolved privately. He referenced Edmund Vale's departure from Hawthorne, with the careful concern of a man establishing deniability. He had of course never had any formal arrangement with Mr. Vale, who had been known to him only as a respectable estate manager, and any implication otherwise was, he was certain, the result of confusion rather than malice. He noted that his daughter Clara, whom he described as having enjoyed a sincere and personal friendship with Mr. Hawthorne, was presently in excellent health and spirits, and would of course refrain from discussing private matters of a sensitive nature with anyone of her acquaintance. He hoped Mr. Hawthorne understood the value of mutual discretion. He hoped. He expected. The letter, for all its courteous language, was a negotiation, a suggestion that what Joseph knew could remain private, and in exchange the Whitmore family would remove themselves from the situation quietly. Joseph read it twice. Then he walked downstairs and put it on Emily's desk without a word. She read it once. Turned the page. Read the second page. Set it down. He's frightened, she said. He should be. What do you want to do? Joseph pulled the chair across from her desk and sat in it. The angled chair, the colleague's chair, the one he had been sitting in for weeks now, as naturally as if it had always been his. Ashworth has the promissory note, the correspondence between Edmund and Thomas Whitmore. The timeline of Clara's introduction to our county circles, and how it maps to Edmund's first letter to William. He looked at Emily. If Ashworth forwards a formal response outlining what we have, and indicating that it has been placed in the hands of the solicitor for the Derbyshire family as well, Whitmore won't move against us. He can't. Emily looked at the letter on her desk. Something moved across her face that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular cold clarity of a woman who had spent months absorbing the full shape of what had been done to her life, and was now looking at its architect's attempt to avoid accountability. Write to Ashworth today, she said. Tell him to respond formally. No threats, no demands, simply a precise accounting of what we have stated plainly with the note that copies exist in multiple hands. She paused. And tell him to send it by courier, not post. I want it in Whitmore's hands before the week is out. Done. Joseph rose. Joseph. He turned. She was still looking at the letter. After this is resolved, after Ashworth closes it. I don't want to discuss the Whitmore family again. I don't want them in our conversations or in this house or in my thinking. Once it's finished, it's finished. Agreed. She picked up her pen. He left the room. He wrote to Ashworth within the hour, and by Thursday of that week, William Whitmore had his answer. They never heard from him again. The December Sunday meeting was the one where Joseph was formally introduced to Dorothy Marsh. Emily did it simply standing beside him at the front of the hall before the meeting began. I believe you know my husband. He wanted to speak with you about the Wednesday school. And then she stepped back deliberately to speak with Agnes about something else entirely, leaving Joseph standing in front of a 60-year-old woman who looked at him with the unhurried assessment of someone who had been on his estate her entire adult life, and had formed her opinion of him long before he'd thought to wonder what it was. Mrs. Marsh. He turned his hat in his hands. He had deliberately brought no proposal documents, no estate papers, nothing that would make the conversation official before she'd decided she wanted it to be. I heard your idea at the November meeting. The school. Dorothy looked at his hat, at his hands, back at his face. You were in the back. I was. Didn't say a word. Mrs. Hawthorne told me to listen. Something shifted in Dorothy's face. Not warmth yet, but interest. The particular interest of a woman who has heard something she did not expect to hear. The school, she said carefully, would need Wednesday afternoons, fuel for the hall, a midday meal for the children who come from the far properties they can't make the walk twice in one day. Agnes has offered to manage the midday meal, Joseph said. The fuel is the estate's responsibility. The hall is available. He paused. I understand this is your project. I'm not looking to put the estate's name on it. I'm looking to remove the obstacles that would stop it from happening. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. My grandson, she said finally. He's 7. He can't read. Joseph held her gaze. He will be able to. It was a simple statement. No flourish. No social performance. Just a man making a commitment to a grandmother who had every reason to wait and see whether he meant it. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. All right, Mr. Hawthorne, she said. We'll try it. She moved past him toward her usual seat. As she passed, she said without looking at him, Your wife told me to give you a chance. I told her I'd give you one chance. A pause. Don't waste it. He stood for a moment holding his hat. Then he went to sit in the back row and listen. January arrived, and with it the hardest test of the autumn's slow progress. Margaret came for dinner on the second Friday of the month and arrived with news instead of wine. Her expression when she came through the door was the one she wore when something had happened that needed managing before it became unmanageable. She sat down in the drawing room and waited until Joseph had left the room before she spoke. He was on his way to the library, and she waited until she heard his footstep on the stairs. Then she looked at Emily. Clara Whitmore is engaged, she said, to a Lord Fenwick in Surrey. It was announced in London 3 days ago. Emily absorbed this in silence. Her father arranged it quickly, Margaret continued. After Ashworth's letter, apparently. He needed her situated before anything became publicly complicated. Emily looked at the fire. Is she happy? Margaret blinked. I don't know. No, I hadn't thought to ask. I find myself hoping she is. Emily's voice was quiet and entirely genuine. Not because I forgive what her family did, but because she was used to. She was a piece her father moved. She may have known some of it and not all of it. A pause. I don't know that I would have handled it differently at her age with a father like William Whitmore. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. You're a more generous woman than I am, she said. I'm a more tired woman, Emily said. I don't have energy left for sustained bitterness. It's too expensive. She turned from the fire. Don't tell Joseph tonight. He'll spend the evening worrying about how I'm receiving the news, and I'd rather just have a quiet dinner. Margaret promised. Dinner was in fact quiet, but afterward. When Margaret had gone, and the house was settling into its nighttime rhythms, Joseph came to the small sitting room where Emily was reading, the one with the window that faced the kitchen garden, and he stopped in the doorway with the look of a man who had heard something from the housekeeper and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. Margaret told Mrs. Harmon, he said, about Clara's engagement. Emily looked up from her book. Of course she did. Are you? He stopped. He tried again. I wanted to ask, but I didn't want to make the evening about it. It isn't about it. She closed the book. I find I'm not what I expected to feel, which is mostly nothing. Some relief, perhaps. She's out of the picture in a formal sense now. He came into the room. He sat in the chair across from her, not the desk chair this time, but the armchair by the fire, the one that faced her chair, the way 2 chairs face each other when the people in them intend to talk rather than work. I want to say something, he said, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond. She set the book down. waited. I spent 8 years in this marriage treating you like a given, like the furniture, like something that would remain constant regardless of what I did or didn't do. His voice was steady and without drama, the voice of a man who had rehearsed nothing and was simply telling the truth. I told myself I respected you, that treating you with basic courtesy was enough, that the absence of cruelty was a kind of care. He looked at his hands. I was wrong about all of it, and I don't say that to ask for forgiveness or to perform contrition. I say it because I want to be certain that you know I know it. Not just that I made mistakes, but what the mistakes actually were. Emily looked at him. Outside, the wind moved through the trees along the kitchen garden fence. I know you know it, she said quietly. Do you believe I know it? A pause. A longer pause than the question seemed to require. The honest kind. Yes, she said. I'm beginning to believe it. He looked at her. Ask me again in the spring, she had said in the kitchen garden in October. He had carried those 5 words through November and December like a compass bearing. He had not asked early. He had not pushed or maneuvered or used sentiment as leverage. He had simply done the work every day unglamorously, without certainty of outcome. He knew sitting in the chair across from her in January that it was not yet spring. He also knew in the particular way that people know things they aren't yet ready to name, that the answer might be different from what he had feared. He didn't ask. He picked up the book he'd been reading before dinner and sat with her in the firelit room, and the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. February brought the Wednesday school its first full month of operation, and Dorothy Marsh's grandson learned to write his name. He wrote it on a small piece of paper and brought it to Dorothy at the Sunday meeting, and Dorothy held it in both hands for a moment before she put it carefully in her coat pocket. She said nothing out loud. But when she glanced across the hall to where Joseph was sitting in the back row, she gave him a nod so slight it was almost invisible. He received it like a man receiving something considerable. March came, and with it the first real warmth and the anniversary audit that Ashworth had built into the corrected accounts framework, a quarterly review of the estate finances formally documented with a summary shared at the Sunday meeting, so that every family on the property knew the state of the accounts that affected them. Joseph attended the March audit with Emily. He sat beside her at the library table while Ashworth reviewed the numbers, and he asked questions when he had them and deferred when she had answers he didn't. Ashworth, at the end of the meeting, gathered his papers and said with the measured satisfaction of a man who dealt professionally in disaster and recognized its absence. The estate is financially stable. I'd go further and say it's well managed, possibly better managed than it has been in 20 years. He looked at Emily. The wage restoration is complete. The new supplier contracts are performing. The mortgage payments are current. He paused. Whatever you've done here, Mrs. Hawthorne, I'd recommend continuing it. Emily accepted that with the composed grace of a woman who was accustomed to doing things correctly and no longer needed external validation to know it. After Ashworth left, the library was quiet. Joseph stood at the window. Emily organized the audit papers. The house moved around them in its steady, competent rhythm. It's March, he said. Emily stilled her hands on the papers. She knew exactly what he meant. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood for a moment with the papers in front of her, and he stood at the window, and the space between them had the particular quality of a breath held by 2 people at the same time. Then she turned. She looked at him across the library, at the man who had come back in October, expecting to find a woman he could manage, who had found instead a woman who had already outgrown the version of herself that he had left behind. She looked at the man who had gone to the stables at 6:30 in the morning with an envelope and no promise of return on the investment, who had sat in the back of the church hall for 3 months without speaking unless asked, who had stood in front of Dorothy Marsh and turned his hat in his hands and made a commitment that he kept, who had spent winter becoming someone she hadn't known he could be and had done it without asking her to witness it or reward it. She looked at him. He looked back. Ask me, she said. He crossed the room, not quickly, deliberately. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at her with no performance in his face at all. Only the honest, unguarded expression of a man who understood that what happened next was not in his control and had made peace with that. "Is there anything left to build?" he asked. "Between us. Not what we had, I know that's gone. Something true. Something that starts from who you actually are and who I'm trying to become." He paused. "Is there anything left?" Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about October, the carriage arriving, the silence in the drive, the way she had stood at the top of that staircase and felt for a fraction of a second, before composure reasserted itself, the old wound open. She thought about Agnes's kitchen table, and Margaret's wine, and Ruth Hollis's tin box under the bed, and Dorothy's grandson writing his name on a small piece of paper. She thought about what it had cost her to keep this estate alive. What it had cost her to keep herself alive inside it. She thought about the man standing in front of her now, who was not the man who had left, who was possibly becoming someone worth standing beside. Possibly. She wasn't certain. She might never be fully certain. Certainty, she had learned, was a luxury that real life rarely offered, and demanding it before proceeding was just another way of standing still. "There's something left," she said. "I don't know yet what shape it will take. I don't know how long it will take. And I want to be clear." Her voice was steady and direct, the voice she used for contracts and commitments, because this was both. "If you go back to who you were, if you stop paying attention, stop showing up, stop doing the work, I will not wait again. I am finished waiting." "I know. I mean it, Joseph. I know you mean it." He held her gaze. "That's why I believe it. And that's why I'm standing here instead of in London." She looked at him. She had expected to feel more uncertain than she did. She had expected the old wound to make more noise. But the thing about wounds she was discovering was that they didn't always announce themselves at the moments you anticipated. Sometimes they simply healed. Not because someone fixed them from outside. Because you stopped reopening them and let time do what time does. She reached out and took his hand. Not as a declaration. Not as forgiveness granted in a formal sense. As the first step in a direction that she had decided with the same clear-headed practicality she brought to every decision that mattered was worth walking. His hand closed around hers. The library was very quiet. Spring arrived at Hawthorne Estate, with the particular generosity of springs that follow hard winters, and the kitchen garden that Emily had stood at the edge of since October came into its first full season under her careful attention. Agnes declared it the best kitchen garden the estate had seen in 30 years. She said this to anyone who would listen, and several who wouldn't, and she was probably right. The Wednesday school had 23 children enrolled by April. Dorothy Marsh ran it with the efficient warmth of a woman who had been waiting her whole life for the opportunity to do something like it. Her grandson read his first sentence aloud at the May meeting, and the hall was entirely silent for a moment before Agnes started clapping and everyone followed. Joseph was in the back row. He clapped too. And then, because it was May, and because he had been sitting in the back row since November, and because the moment seemed to require it, he stood up. Not to speak, just to stand. To let the boy see that the man who sat in the back every Sunday had risen to his feet. Dorothy's grandson looked at him across the hall with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a 7-year-old who has done something difficult and is happy to have a witness. Joseph nodded at him. The boy grinned. It was not a grand moment. It did not go into any record or ledger. But Agnes saw it, and Margaret saw it, because she had started attending the Sunday meetings in March and was apparently never going to stop, and Emily saw it from where she sat 3 rows ahead. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had felt the shift in the room when he stood. She felt it, and she let herself feel it, and she did not qualify the feeling or make it smaller than it was. Bram Hollis said it first. The way plain men often say the important things without ceremony in the middle of something else. He was in the estate office in June, going over the summer harvest projections with Joseph and Emily together, because by June, that was simply how things were done at Hawthorne, both of them at the desk working through the same numbers. Hollis had stopped finding it remarkable 3 months ago. They were finishing the last page when Hollis leaned back in his chair and looked at them for a moment with the considering expression of a man who has decided to say something. "My wife wants me to tell you," he said, "that this estate is different. She said it's the first time in 30 years she's felt easy about things." Emily looked at him. Easy, like things aren't going to fall apart without warning. Hollis turned his hat in his hands. Like someone's actually minding the place. He glanced at Joseph. "Both of you. Together." A pause. "She wanted you to know she notices." Joseph looked at Emily. Emily looked at the projection report. "Tell Mrs. Hollis we appreciate it," she said. Her voice was even, but her hand resting on the desk beside the report had a slight tension in it that wasn't tension, but its opposite, the particular stillness of someone absorbing something good. After Hollis left, the office was quiet. "Both of you," Joseph said. "Together." Emily kept looking at the report. "Don't let it go to your head." "I won't." A pause. "Emily." She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for not deciding in October that the answer was already no, for giving me until spring, for—" He stopped. The words were insufficient, and he knew it. "For what you built here, all of it. Not because it saved the estate, but because it was you. It was entirely you, and you did it when no one was asking you to, and you did it right." She looked at him for a long moment. The truth was that she had done it for herself, and for the people who depended on Hawthorne, and because it was right exactly as she had told him from the beginning. She had not done it for him. But it had led here. To this office, this death, these numbers, this man across from her, who had learned slowly, imperfectly, consistently to see her. She was not certain of everything. She might never be certain of everything. That was fine. Certainty was for contracts. This was something else. "The summer harvest projections need to go to Ashworth by Friday," she said. "I'll write the cover letter this afternoon." She looked down at the report, then back at him. Then quietly, without drama, the way she did everything that mattered, she smiled. Not wide, not performed. The small, genuine smile of a woman who has built something real and can afford now to let herself know it. Joseph Hawthorne saw it and held it the way you hold the first warmth of spring. After a winter, you weren't sure you'd survive. People told the story of Hawthorne Estate for years after, but they never quite told it right. They told it as the story of a man who left and came back changed. They told it as the story of a scandal averted, a fortune preserved, a marriage salvaged. They got the facts mostly correct and the meaning almost entirely wrong. Because the story of Hawthorne Estate was not about what Joseph Hawthorne came back to. It was about what Emily Winthrop Hawthorne built in his absence and refused to dismantle when he returned and continued building after he finally learned to help. It was about Agnes, who kept 40 years of papers in a box and knew exactly when to hand them over, about Ruth Hollis and her tin under the bed, about Dorothy Marsh standing in a cold church hall giving a boy the tools to write his own name, about Bram Hollis telling his wife he finally felt easy about things, about Margaret Ellison arriving every week with wine or news, or both, refusing to let Emily face any of it alone. It was about the wages paid to the penny, and the contracts renegotiated on honest terms, and the accounts opened and documented and shared. It was about a woman who was told for 8 years that the estate was not her concern, and who discovered when it was left entirely in her hands that she had always been its true keeper. A house is not built from stone. It is built from the daily decisions of the people who choose to stay inside it and do right by the ones who depend on them. Emily Winthrop Hawthorne had always known that. It just took Hawthorne Estate and the man who finally learned to deserve it a little